So, raise your hands. Shamitru, you can start. Then you and you mind taking 3 questions in a row?
What's that?
Do you mind taking 3 questions in a row?
Sure.
Yeah? Okay.
Your words?
You know how they do that. It's your choice.
Just interested about like this case that you have shown, population and so what's the role of distance when you look for it? So a lot of reasons that you have shown, like I completely agree with that. Economic vulnerability is not in add-ons, and a lot of that is unaccounted for in the studies that you did. But what forces a person who goes through these various kind of vulnerabilities, are they significantly different when a person comes from that far? I mean, say Nepal and Bengal have certain cases that you have shown, right? And stay homeless and be vulnerable at that's do this.
So we saw here that some of the folks that we talked to are say like in the 30 to 40 category of age, right? With that role. And so too at some point they start families, and what happens when they are there with their families, and is there a tipping point or like is there a critical point beyond which they're able to leverage whatever mobility they may have had, whatever little mobility they've had, to transform this homelessness to a more stable sort of way of life.
Okay. Third question. Yeah.
Yeah, when you pointed out about UP and Bihar, most of the homeless people from there, number one. And number two, here in Delhi, what I have seen with my own eyes is that around ISPP, there are a lot of people over there, homeless, which are, sleeping on the pavements and all that. Do they have bathrooms which they access? Where do they keep their stuff? Those are the things. But now, the state government here has come up with, these rare baseras, centers for homeless people. Do they really help? Do they really help these people? And obviously, one of the most important reasons they come to Delhi for work, or other big cities for work. So, do these rare baseras really help them? And the role of the state is I think the state has a big role in looking after homeless children, number one, which to some extent they have done in Delhi, but also the adults to look after them. The state has a big role to play in that. I want your clarification on this. Thank you.
Thanks. Really good questions. So Shaminder's question first: what role does distance play? Essentially, I came to these categorizations because the patterns of what they experienced in early life, regardless of where they came from, and their responses to it, regardless of where they came from, seem to have much more relevance. It seemed to fit much more than what you're asking, suggesting, which is totally, that's what I thought too. You would think that somebody from UP or Bihar, actually UP mainly, there would be a kind of transient corridor, which there are. It's not that there are not. It's just that you will find in each of these categories, people from UP will be scattered throughout those categories too. And I could go deeper into the data to look specifically at that. But from my understanding, it's the patterns in the early life experiences and the responses to it that have much more of a kind of connection across all the states, at least as of now is the way I'm looking at it. So actually, UP, there is somebody in each of these cases. Yeah, sorry. So, yes, do they start families? And is there a tipping point to which they can transform their condition into a moment of stability? So, yes, many of them have families already, you know, I wouldn't say necessarily before they come, but on that journey of going back either home or to other cities in their lifespan of homelessness, right? So the average age is about 37. The average years on the street is about 19 or so. And what you find is, in both cases, the chronic and the transient cases, that marriage is something that is common to all, and having children is common to all. But at the same time, in many of the chronic cases, the collapse of family structure, not only the nuclear family that they came from, but the family then that they had started kind of repeats itself too. And as far as the stability question, see, there is a particular kind of stability even in transience. And again, I'm reading from perception, meaning that there are, like particularly family men, who they support their parents, they are married, they have kids, some of them, and they view this as a means to supporting their family. So sometimes these are not mutually exclusive. I mean, from their perspective, it is a form of support. The tipping point, I think that you're alluding to, does happen in some of these, what are called these exit cases, right? We studied how people enter, how they survive vis-a-vis some of the shelters that you'd asked about, and how in some minority cases they exit. And what you do see is that through certain social organizations, the traditional form of stability that we're kind of talking about in these minority of cases is achieved through those kinds of interventions. But the stability that is achieved in these cases is one that is kind of without that support. So, I mean, I would say again, like the perception is, it's very uncomfortable at times, but it's also very important to see how they view that. Because I myself am surprised to hear sometimes that is, you know, a viable option, at least in somebody's mind, that it's a viable option when it doesn't look like it is. And then lastly, you were asking about the ISBT homeless and if the shelters really help, right?
Yeah, but are they mostly from UP and Bihar?
In that area, or just in general? In Delhi, I mean, based on the large, like UNDP survey and even ASHRAE's survey, most are from UP, yes, yes. Those are like large-scale surveys. UP and Bihar, right? And as far as if the shelters help, see, the second part of this research is on survival, and we took 10 shelters in 7 locations, and we tried to actually just understand this whole scale. And what you see is there are typologies for those cases too. There is a subset, which is linked to these guys, of people who are directly connected to particular geographies where labor Mondays can be found, where assurances of daily wage labor can be found, and many of those places are where those shelters are built. So that's on the surface, right? That those shelters are a natural extension of the use of those areas in the first place for survival needs. So if you talk to many of these people, like in Fatehpuri, in Dandi Park, which is by ISBT, right? If we're talking about the same ISBT, I think you will find that these guys who I call the connected, meaning they're connected to the labor money, they're connected to the shelter via the labor money, will say that the shelter is good for them. They will also tell you stories that are quite uncomfortable about dealing with violence, right? About seeing death on the streets outside, right? About experiencing abuse in the workplace. So, as far as providing a place for some of these people, and I'm talking about even low usage shelters, like Roshanara is a low usage shelter, but it's by a chowk called Gantagar Chowk. And most men who use that shelter will say that it supports my needs, even though the stories they tell you are quite harrowing. However, there are then shelters for, families. Jama Masjid, Sant Nagar. Those families were residents of jogis which were demolished. So in a sense, those shelters are a failure of a policy that should be in place, which is resettlement, right? They should have been put in some resettlement colony, or they should have been provided housing. And so the relationship that those people have to that shelter is an understanding that this is better than being on the street. Now again, that from the face of it, there's a failure of the policy. From the experience of it, they negotiate with the shelter caretakers for services, meaning that they do get services from those caretakers because they've been in those areas so long. So I would say, in short, that the shelters where they are placed provides some protection for laborers, but does not go nearly far enough, to provide a kind of stable kind of life.
Okay, second round of question. Down, and then we take. Then we will take
So one of the things that's apparent from the life stories that people are telling, it's on this. You can hear her voice. It makes a very good, so you don't hear the distortion, so you don't think
Now it's fine. So,
So one of the things that I hear in the life story is how much sexual abuse is a part of the story. And in a way, government policy, the High Court case about homelessness, it's all about providing shelter, and then even warmth in the winter, toilets, all of that. It's got an infrastructural sort of orientation, whereas a very large part of the story is actually vulnerability to abuse, and people becoming in some ways unanchored from children especially, becoming unanchored from their families or family structures that are falling apart, being vulnerable to abuse. And the sort of response to homelessness doesn't deal with that, perhaps because it's so uncomfortable.
So I was interested, Ashwin, in
he's looking down here.
Oh yeah.
So sort of speaking of that picture you put up out there, and you've sort of been quite insistent that you're speaking from their narratives and their perceptions and sort of the way. A lot of what you spoke today at least was coming from that position, and that's their lived reality. That street, that under the flyover, that wherever it is. How was it sort of moving between your world and their world as a researcher? And so I'm basically asking a methodological question of the life history as a method, as well as how hard was it to sort of actually see things from their perspective, even though you're hearing the words and writing these stories, transcribing these interviews, because their lived reality is just so different from that of most other people.
Third question. Oh.
Mike is coming to me. It's walking across the room.
that you spoke about, and how mobile phones and other forms of technology may play a role in maintaining networks with their family or whoever friends back home, and then also people they may meet even at shelters and while working.
So should I take this question?
Yeah, you want to take more?
No, it's fine. Yeah. Yeah. So you're absolutely right about this issue of abuse, right? Now, it's one of those areas that is very uncomfortable because the people who shared some of these stories about their early life, sometimes it was on only the second, third conversation, meaning it wasn't on the first conversation. It's because of that, and I'll say, flat out, we didn't speak to everybody 3 times. So that's an access issue. So one of the reasons that it's difficult to respond to, abuse is because so much of it is hidden. Now, there are places in the city that that it happens. And that's because people will say that it happens, that's where rape happens. And that, in particular, Jama Masjid, a lot of the shelter infrastructure that came about from like 2014 to 2016 was in response to the inadequacies of the shelters to prevent rapes from happening. So the fencing came up, and I think, 2013, 2014, very much in response to the justified complaints that women and girls were still being targeted. Now, the same kind of abuse, I would say the same form of abuse happens also in places that you wouldn't expect it, meaning it happens in single male enclaves. One of them is the Yamuna Bazaar area. And now, I only know that anecdotally. I only know that because people started to say these things. But what makes it difficult to map is that, yes, many of these things are very much under wraps.
I think not just the abuse of people who are already homeless.
Oh, right,
That's
definitely.
a social problem.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Children being subject to abuse, and that being one of the things that's
Absolutely.
pushing people out and pushing people into far more vulnerable situations.
No, absolutely. So that's why I think that what I'm trying to always look at is what happens alongside it, right? So like what would make some of these people physically vulnerable, like vulnerable to being in an insecure situation? All I can say from my limited experience in reading is that the earlier somebody is flung out into the world, the greater the risk that, especially in these areas, they will be targeted. And that is, it's very difficult to know what kind of policy, what kind of intervention is necessary. Yeah.
Children are definitely, okay.
Next round, first, because, time.
So as far this is a really interesting thing because it's, you always think about it. How is it moving between your world and their world? I have to say that I'm very fortunate that I got to work with, 2 very seasoned researchers who understand that world, better than I do. And in the field, their understanding of that world helped me understand. But of course, sometimes many times you're not together. And when you see things and you hear things that are outside of your world in total, you have very limited grammar, very limited experience to kind of graft that onto. And without sounding like far-fetched, I will just share this anecdote. What helped me was, honestly, I started to realize that, because I would pore over these transcripts, right? We would do the recording, get the transcript, and I would translate, and I would just pore over them for the coding and just trying to understand all the contradictions. And in my experience, what helped me was that there was a lot of similarities to rap lyrics. To rap lyrics. There were in many cases, like especially Tupac Shakur. I literally, there were some verbatim almost passages or just like lines that I had heard in rap songs. And that for some reason helped me, not that I didn't come from the same areas as rappers did, but at least I grew up with that music and it was a lexicon that I understood. So it helped. So yeah. And lastly, this is a very good question, about the networks, like how technology, how mobile phones maybe enhances like somebody's either access to networks or just the way that networks work. Yes, absolutely. The takedars, right? The guys who hire laborers, they're connected. They have, that's how they work actually. They go from shelter to shelter, you know, they sleep in different shelters, they scout at different street locations and at the Mundi, and they are cell phones. So the guys that are connected to them, once you get connected to a takedar, you are connected to them, you know, through a phone, essentially. So the guy who gets the call from the takedar is, I mean, that's not an easy position to be in, or it's not an easy position to get. You have to like earn the trust of somebody. Now, exactly how those guys get those phones, I should dig deeper. But I do know that of these guys, the family men, they are directly connected to the local takedar. They get the call from a takedar, or they know somebody who's getting, they're friends, they're buddies with the guy who gets the call. And so that's a phrase also, like, you know, the guy who gets the call, I get the call, when I get the call. Then those guys are, yes, a little bit more connected into the labor network.
And does that have any relationship with the transients or transient?
Yeah, I mean, from my understanding, it is those family, it is the transient, it is the guys that are on the move who maybe have a little bit more, you know, they're a little bit more resilient in a way. They're moving between different chalks and sometimes different cities. And you do see a difference between them and maybe somebody who's abandoned.
Okay, third round. So you had something you wanted to add, then Pushpa, and then I have also some questions. Then I'll also come in. I include myself.
When you talk of abuse, it's children who are most vulnerable to that, isn't it?
Well, it depends how you look at it. No, I mean, men, and I didn't get into that here, but as far as one of the vulnerabilities while homelessness, one of the risks of being homeless and experiencing a worse form of homelessness is the abuse that men face at the work sites, and particularly those that go to dhabas. So all these guys will tell you that dhabas are the places, particularly in Haryana, where you will experience abuse. Some of them are chained to the tandoor, or some of them are beaten, and you know, this is what they've told me. Yeah,
Is that widespread?
that's widespread. Yeah, and that's, I mean, I didn't cover it here, but I cover it in the survival portions. So that the abuse is rampant in both early life and in terms of living in the city. Yeah, it is rampant.
But it's,
And on the farms too.
yeah, just one last the fact that, you know, many people, they come to Delhi to work, but they can't bring their families. You know, because it's too expensive to stay here.
Right.
You know, to rent a place or whatever, maybe they can rent a place in a group or something like that. So therefore, you know, they are homeless, so they don't have a cheaper alternative. But you know, the people that I did see it around ISPT, that area, some of them looked really vulnerable actually, you know, they looked very unhealthy and vulnerable.
Yeah.
So, you know, finally, what is the solution? It is really these shelters, isn't it? Run by government, mainly they're run by government, I think in Delhi. For the children, they're run by NGOs. You know, I think that's the only
Yes.
answer.
No, all the shelters are run by NGOs. Yes, all the shelters are run by NGOs, but the
Usually adults.
yeah, even the adults. But you're right that, I mean, in the sense that they have a different relationship to the government. Um, see, there are about 200 NGOs, and about 3 of them run over 70% of them. So the NGOs, the governance of these spaces is largely dependent on the relationship that the NGO has with the Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board. Now, the shelters for children are under the jurisdiction of the social welfare the child welfare committees, social welfare department. They are not under the Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board. So sometimes, like, the variation that you see in the way that those spaces are maintained, in the way that they're governed, right, is a function of, yes, those multiple jurisdictions. But as far as being a solution, I do think there's a large scope for how those spaces, because they are already in areas that people inherently have to use, like for work, can be, can be upgraded, can be used as even momentary hostels or temporary stays while somebody is, trying to earn enough to, feed somebody elsewhere. Yeah. They're not all bad, and yet there's vast need for improvement. And I'm only basing that off of what people say. I can't say that they're all bad if people that are living there are not all telling me that, right? Even if you look at it and it's bare bones, there's no bedding, it's very difficult to put together their perception with what you see. Because I don't know how they live there, but yeah.
We need to move to other questions.
And then you can take your full round, because otherwise everybody needs to.
Thank you, Ashwin. I know you are doing very challenging work, but I'm going to add on to your challenges.
For sure, yeah.
There are 3 questions that come to my mind. Perhaps you have looked at these questions in a bigger study and you have not presented it today. I didn't hear the word beggars as homeless. So are they unemployed, employed, not in the homeless category, or passively you picked up 50 employed people from your study? So I would like a response to that. Second, you talked about mobility from city to city.
Yeah.
What about mobility within the city? Because these are casual workers mostly, and they would respond to employment opportunities coming up anywhere in the city, so they would move. So what kind of mobility, or forced out, for example, people who are staying on the roadside and there is a road widening project. So people are pushed out. Very recently, all the flyovers went through in Delhi this beautification. They have all become gardens, and they have got statues and fountains and so on. What happened to the people? Where did they go? There were people living there. So a very important question is to see how people are either choosing to move or being forced to move within the city, and what kind of pattern emerges. So, and third, everyone is talking about what next, and not only entry typologies, what are the exit typologies, if at all? Shelter is one. People opting out, finding homes, is it happening at all? Resettlement, government programs, what is happening? And one successful case comes to my mind, and that is pavement dwellers resettlement program supported by SPAR, and that was quite successful, and people got housing. So, along with entry, we need to look at exit typologies.
For sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thanks. Those are really good questions. So the first part about why no beggars. So yes, these 60 are working people, and in a larger sect of about 120 that were from the survival portion. I believe 95 of them were men. So essentially, it was that there were about 7 people begging out of that 117. and 4 of them were women, and 3 of them were men. So the reason I don't use that word here is not, it's not for any belief system or anything. It's just that that's who we were looking at. And of those 60 guys that we found on at Yamuna Pushta and North Delhi, they were yes, they inhabited a fairly active labor geography, right? And so they were, even if they weren't working at the time, meaning a few days, they were in the search for work, meaning their unemployment wasn't because they were not looking. Their unemployment was a supply-demand issue, but they were not beggars at the same time. And the second part, which is what about mobility within the city, either for labor demand or because they're being pushed out for beautification projects. So in this portion, these 60 guys, right? The first one would apply, the second wouldn't. And the reason that the second wouldn't is because that would apply to family or community-wide homelessness, which we cover in the survival portion. These, as far as the beautification, under the flyovers, which you've seen in the last couple of years, that is not a Yamuna Pushta story. That is a South Delhi story. That is some of these areas that were pushing out communities that had lived under the flyovers. So, but the first part is relevant, where people move from within the city based on work. However, what happens is, you're right, but what happens is that they're going to a nodal point for many of those jobs. They're going to a particular labor chowk. And so in Old Delhi, it's either the labor chowk out in front of Old Delhi railway station, Company Bagh, or Ghantaghar near Roshanara, and Shahadra also is another one. So essentially, the mobility is directed from finite places in the city. But they do move from place to place, you're absolutely right, yes.
That's a network too.
Yeah, that is definitely a network, yeah. And as far as the exit typology is absolutely right, so we cover that in a third portion, which is the exit stories.
We have to wait for 2 more seminars.
Okay, yeah.
It was a 3-part study, right?
3 parts.
Entry, existence, and exit.
Oh, it's written.
Today is just a presentation of the entry part.
Right, but the question came to mind.
Yes.
No, it's a relevant question,
Right. But you have any comments, short comments? on
Yeah,
that?
so I was about to say a very short comment on this. Those cases are much smaller in number, but essentially divided up into, there's 3 basic ones, right? One, were these guys who I call the strivers, and I'm still, I'm not very comfortable with that term, but I may change it. But essentially, those, just like you mentioned, right? There must have been guys that came to the city and then they somehow got how, and these are long stories of how exactly a couple of these guys did that. They came as children. They just hustled their whole lives until, their early 30s, they got out of homelessness. And it's a very intricate story, but it's so rare. I've never actually heard that story that, I followed this guy and he told me his whole story. And so the other 2 are through social organizations. One is the homeless person that was in a bad way, out on the streets or had been picked up by the beggary law, and the intervention by organizations like Koshish, TIS, they acted as agents to the state on their behalf and were able to either reintegrate them with their family or get them housing. The third one that's also related is that these people that were on the street actually then became part of civil society. The social organizations took them under their wing, and then they worked with them, and these people became motivated, and then they became the next generation. Right. So those are basically those are the 3 types.
What did you call the third guy?
So I forget what I actually, to tell you the truth, I forget the name that I gave, but those are the three categories. Yeah, yeah. But they became part of civil society.
That question I didn't want to go to, but there's a whole lot. But for now, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Later on.
Okay.
I also have three questions.
Yeah.
I start with from order of short answers. First is, are some of these homeless, since you say homeless and poverty, and are some of these homeless above poverty rate or not? So,
Are they above poverty?
yeah, some of them, do they earn more than what would be qualifying as poverty rate or not? Are they all poor or not? First question. Second is, Pushpa said you didn't mention beggars, but you did not mention caste. And nobody mentioned it in your narrative, so it's very surprising. I mean, people chained in Tandoor, I think, means, I mean, I want to know about the caste dimension.
Yeah.
And my third question is, typologies is, and I know I understand because you have 60 people, so it's very difficult to use other methods like ACP or, but typologies is a very old school ways of doing this kind of work.
Yeah.
And because of that, you're using only two dimensions of your, maybe somehow the economics one, and then the kind of life adversity.
Yeah.
And it does two things. First, it kind of prevents to see graduation or, like clouds. It kind of, okay, you can always say these typologies are fluid and this and that, of course, that you will say, but it tends to, simplify, I think, the complexity of the narrative. So I don't know what would be the other indicators. I was thinking maybe what is the connection with the family? What kind of linkages? I mean, you know your data by heart, I think, so you need. So it's just a methodology question, right? A lot of sociology has been fighting against typologies. So, and I've tried to use other methods to be able to take more than two axes. Right now, your typology is based on two axes. How, of course, if you complexify too much, then you lose the ability to, but if you had even a basic, I don't know, classification, hierarchy classification or something like that, maybe we could see, visualize it in a different way.
Sure.
I don't know, I'm just saying, it's just open for discussion, but I feel it both makes it too simple and it undermines the strength of your narrative. So did you think of this? What are the problems, obstacles to do that?
Sure, yeah, thanks. Very good questions. So are they above poverty?
Some of them,
Well, so the urban poverty, income poverty would be what, I think 26 rupees a day, right, by the 2009, or sorry, the 2011 cutoff. So what you see is that for different types of jobs, right? Shadi party, you would get between 500 and 700 rupees per shift, but that shift is about 36 hours. So, so that's about, it's about 3 straight days. You would see that on average, somebody would be working at the most 5 of these shifts a month, right? And so by what would that be then? I haven't worked it out, but it would be based on that kind of calculation. And then also what happened, the variable in the DABA and the construction line is many times people don't get paid. So I don't have a breakdown of the days, exact days that people get paid and don't get paid. I just have information that it's routine to not get paid all the time, to not get paid consistently. The good thing about the Shadi party work is that they do get paid routinely, but the hours are like I said, 24 to 36 hours straight, and you can't work that more than 4 to 5 times a month. The second question on caste, I have to admit, is there's a gap here in my understanding because not everyone has reported their caste. And I have information on like the landless labor or the group of people that came from agricultural labor backgrounds came from lower castes, but I don't have uniform information across the board on that. So that is a
They don't use it in their narrative.
no. See, one of the things we found was that most head-on questions about caste were deflected. People would say, they wouldn't say like, I don't want to talk about it. They would say, oh, there was no caste discrimination where I come from. Everybody gets along. We don't even see caste or something like that. Many times that was the kind of question and answer. So to get around that, I just didn't poke much further into that. But I can see where that could be a bit of a problem. And the third one, as far as the typology is a problem. So what I'm trying to do with the typology is to give enough base structure of a framework that holds the nuances of the stories together, because the stories or the narratives themselves are quite in-depth. And it is from those narratives, which are essentially telling the whole life story based on these nodes, but where these nodes kind of where the variations in perceptions, experiences, responses to these axes differ, then the analysis is based on that, with the hope that, okay, you have a base structure with these typologies that have taken these critical 2-3 aspects as a framework, and the variation that exists in these stories will elucidate further, how these patterns emerge over the life course of homelessness. That's as far as I've taken it thus far.
Any more questions? In the back, no? All yours?
There's one more question.
Yeah, sorry, there's more. You go, sorry.
Related to the question about caste, does it not play a role in the homeless shelters?
In what way? In terms of space?
I mean, who can share spaces in close proximity?
I'll have to say that I have not seen that, but I have seen other distinctions place, state, but I have not seen caste, and we've asked about that. But in the shelter itself, it does not bear out.
Religion?
Sorry?
Religion?
Religion in not in a physical sense, but but yes, in perception of who has stake and who has more access. Like in Jama Masjid, religion does play a role to a certain extent. There are perceptions of both, of non-Muslims of Muslims and Muslims of non-Muslims.
So, quickly, I think, follow up on okay. So, to go back to your typology table, the table structure which was there.
The one with those,
And summary for
the early
the
childhood.
CTD one. This one.
So,
All these numbers.
and to sort of take off from what Patrick was asking, so if I look at this table,
Yeah.
one of the things that seems to come out from the table is that if you're looking at chronically homeless people, it seems that family conflict seems to be one of the major contributors to chronic homelessness. Right. Which makes sense because one of the ways in which you look at chronic homelessness is people who don't have something to go back to. And if, as you said, they're abandoned or expelled, then obviously there is a certain rupture in that relationship, which is difficult to repair. Right. Now, and this is where I'm sort of taking off from my head, is to try to understand that are there within this broad area of family or social conflict, is there a lot of nuance? Like whether it's about age, how long you've been away, the kind of relationship you've had with the family, for example. One is a runaway, which you also talk about as chronically homeless. But in some sense, a runaway is somebody who could possibly find a welcome if that person went back home, but on the other hand, if your parents have died and all you're left with is family. So trying to get a sense from you across these 22 cases, what kind of richness do we have in that particular subject? And second is this whole issue of, which came up quite a lot, of shelters. And one of the things that we have seen from examining the data from shelters is that the occupancy of shelters is always extremely, in almost all locations, well below capacity. So the question therefore is to try, do you get any sense, I know this goes into your existence issuances, since people have talked about exit and people have talked about entry, but we could throw a little bit of light on if whatever learnings you've had on the issue of why is it that people choose not to occupy a shelter when a shelter is actually.
Great. So for the first question, is there nuance, right? So in terms of pegging the conflict at its relation to moving out, right? I mean, there are tensions at times between the homeless person and a family member that he may be supporting. That's there. So the nuance is the extent to which the conflict leads to, yes, a rupture in the family bond and the exit out of the home. So based on those, as best as I could make or understand, the nuance in the family conflict essentially is largely these three: abandoned, expelled, runaway, largely, right? With some showing up in the tensions between in the supplementers, right? Where you see, because you have both chronic and transient in these two groups. And so some of the conflict that comes out in the replacements and the supplementers is the nature of their relationship between people that they have to support. Whereas the first three are almost complete, like a scythe. It's like it changes the trajectory of life into homelessness almost one-to-one. So the best to my knowledge, across those 22 cases, I see three hard kind of nuances and two softer or more, or two hard, one-to-one relationships and two more nuanced ones with these two groups here, right? Does that make sense? With the replacements and the supplementers. That's across those cases, that's the ambit of those combinations. There are a couple cases where so the reason that I've done this as typologies is because there are cases that share some patterns of more than one, right? So that's why, not too many actually, but there are a couple. So that's, and I can dig deeper into those patterns to come out to see if they are exactly accurate across those nuances of the family conflict. Or, yeah.
And in terms of those who are chronically homeless, do you have a sense of the education level, structures? I'm just looking to the policy story here. Right?
Yeah. I should have put the numbers up, but so the average years of education across the board is, I believe, 5 to 6 years of education. And you do see that among the chronically homeless, there's a higher proportion of illiteracy or 0 years of education. Yeah. The second part was the shelter question, right? Why don't some men use the ones that are below capacity? So the so we have a whole I haven't put that together yet, but we have a whole study on that of mixing between guys that are in the shelter, guys that are not in the shelter, and guys that are using both the shelter and the street. I don't have the conclusions to that yet, but I'll speak now anecdotally from what I understand of these areas, right? Which is that there are in particular, like you mentioned, the low shelter areas like Roshanara and what are some other ones? Fatehpuri. So each of these low shelter or low occupancy areas, like I said before, also have in some nearby space some kind of linkage to a labor chalk. Now you have the critical mass of people that are using the shelter are, yes, directly connected to that labor chalk. Many of them are also connected to other amenities like shopkeepers who store their money. So what I can say right now is that many of the men that don't use that space but also use the labor chalk are often new, are often afraid of people in those shelters, have had bad experiences with those shelters, like violence. So this is what I was saying again about the complexity, which is that there are people like in Fatehpuri who use the shelter because that is where they have a roof over their head next to the place where they work, but they've also braved violence. There are people that sleeping outside that won't come inside the shelter because they are afraid of that violence because they've had their pockets picked, right? So some of those factors they play out differently for men who either have some kind of protection or don't have kind of protection and or are new or experienced. But I'll have a better, once I finish this other one, I'll have a better understanding of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very good questions. Helps me a lot. Thanks a lot.
Pleasure.
There are many more people looking at here.